Today, I have a really interesting pen that deserves some attention, and that is this Ranga Model 3. It doesn't really matter which Ranga model you purchase. A lot of what I'm going to say in this video is going to apply for most of the pens they make, even though they make pens that are smaller than this, larger than this. The points that I'll make are fairly consistent across the Ranga range. So first of all, this pen is a rather large pen. Let's compare it to everyone's favorite, the Lamy Safari. And you can see the Lamy Safari is not a small pen, but this Ranga is substantially bigger, both longer and wider. So I would say this is big enough to call it an oversized pen. This pen represents a bit of a value proposition, and I want to talk to you about what I feel are the pros and cons of this pen and whether it makes sense at its approximately $100 US asking price, at least here in the US. I've heard this is significantly less expensive if you buy this in India, where this pen is made. So let's start with the pros. As you saw with the comparison to the Lamy, this is a large pen. Why do I say this is a value proposition? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first is that this pen is made out of ebonite, which is basically a hard rubber. And when you think about ebonite, pens that come to mind are pens like the Sailor King pen, the Pilot Custom Urushi, the Pilot Emperor. In general, ebonite pens are really expensive. This pen is completely made of ebonite, including the section, and it is under $100. The second point is that large pens tend to be expensive, and this is a large pen. And the third pro of this pen and why it's a value proposition is that this pen is completely handmade, and it has a handmade feel to it. So there's a bit of inconsistency across how the body is shaped. The pens are not consistent in terms of pen to pen, so each pen is a bit unique. So the shape of the pen, there are minor inconsistencies with each and every pen. So it is truly a handmade pen, and handmade pens tend to be expensive. So if you consider this is ebonite, this is a large pen, and this is handmade for $100, pretty good deal. So what about the cons? Well, the first con I will say is that owing to the handmade nature of the pen, it is actually quite inconsistent. So this is my second one of these pens. I bought this pen, this was a pandemic purchase from Pen Chalet. The first one I got of these was brown. It showed up, and some reason the finial here just separated from the rest of the cap. I have no idea how. It just sort of separated, and it deformed a bit, and I couldn't get it back on. So the nice folks at Pen Chalet were kind enough to take that pen back and send me this one, which is the only other one that they had. So it's a different color. Same model in name. However, the pens felt completely different. This one tapered a lot more than the other one I had. The section material was completely different. So this one has a very pronounced ridge here at the front of the section. The first one I got certainly didn't. And the threads felt different. This is truly handmade, and there's inconsistencies there. So that's one con. Another con is that this, even though this is ebonite, this is not alternative to a Sailor King of Pen ebonite or like a Pilot Custom Urushi. The quality of the material is very, very different. And this ebonite, out of the box, it has a very strong odor, which Even now, this pen is almost 2 years old. It still has a bit of the odor. It's died down a bit, but this is not the same level of quality as those other pens I mentioned. And the final con is the nib that it came with. The nib that comes with this pen is a Bach #6 nib, and my experience with Bach nibs has been extremely varied, really hit or miss. The original nib that came with this pen was terrible. It was a broad nib, over polished, and scratchy. So not really sure. I think it was a combination of having baby's bottom and the tines misaligned. So it just wasn't a good nib. One solution is to replace this with a Bach #6 titanium nib, which is really nice, but at that point, the nib is almost the price of the pen. So that's it could be a bit of a hard pill to swallow. I know I said that was the final con. One other just logistical challenge with this pen is that Ranga, being a fairly small brand outside of India, this is not the easiest pen to just buy. It's not available from all resellers. I mentioned I bought this from Pen Chalet. They have it sometimes. They have it out of stock sometimes. There are other retailers like I think Peyton Street Pens is a Ranga distributor. But wait times could vary. Availability could vary. So not the easiest pen to buy. So anyway, those are the pros and cons. Overall, this is a large ebonite handmade pen that feels rather special for under $100. So in my mind, pretty good value proposition. Let's see how this titanium nib writes. So I just want to caveat this by saying, again, the nib that came with this pen is not this nib, and to upgrade to the titanium nib makes this closer to a $200 pen than a $100 pen. So it really does take away a bit from the value proposition, but nonetheless, let's take a look at how this writes. This is a Ranga Model 3. This is a Bach #6 titanium. And this is a fine, but titanium nibs, the fine is really quite wide, and the nib is really quite wet as well. So fine, but it writes really more like a medium or like a Japanese broad. I am a big fan of Bach titanium nibs. If you haven't had a chance to try a titanium nib, I highly encourage you to do so, whether it's this #6 size nib or the less common and more expensive #8. They are both really pleasant nibs. The other thing that is pretty cool with this review, this ink I'm using is Pelikan Blue Black. And why that's special is Pelikan Blue Black has some slight iron gall tendencies, which means it makes the ink more resistant to water. It also dries very dark, and it's just a very cool look. I love blue black inks. Many of you know that my favorite ink and the ink that I use by far the most out of any inks is Pilot Blue Black. This Pelikan Blue Black is a lot darker, and I really do enjoy this ink. It's a great fit for this titanium nib because like I said earlier, this nib tends to write quite wet, and Pelikan inks in general tend to run dry. So this is an ink that wouldn't do particularly well in some of my Japanese pens, but here it's really nice. So I want to end by just talking a bit about this titanium nib and what it's like to write with, and why, for me personally, even though this nib costs about as much as the pen, I felt it was a worthwhile upgrade. The steel Bach nib that came with this was terrible. Titanium nibs offer a really nice bounce to the writing. They are not flexible. It's not that they offer any significant amount of line variation, but I'm not sure if you can tell in just these loops, because of the bounce, they do offer a really nice level of shading. So if your ink has a gradient of colors, and this Pelican Blue Black is a great example of that. You can see it goes from a blue all the way through to a truer black, and because of the iron gall tendencies, you see what I wrote earlier. Now that it's drying, it dries much darker. So having this sort of bouncy nib does also help show off some of that shading. But overall, this nib is just a pleasure to write with. The bounciness gives a bit of additional character. It's got a little bit of that pencil-like feedback, if you can hear from the camera. It's got a little bit of that, not as pronounced as Sailor nibs or Platinum nibs, but this is not an ultra smooth, glassy smooth nib. There's a nice amount of feedback that makes the nib quite precise, and the bouncy nature of the nib, that sort of softness and springiness of the nib, just adds a lot to the writing. I really find this a lot of fun to use. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Ranga. This is, like I said, a Model 3, but the majority of their pens, you could say the same things about. There are some larger models that use number 8 nibs, but for the most part, what I said in this video about this pen applies to the majority of the pens that Ranga makes. To me, they are a solid value proposition, as long as you go in eyes wide open, knowing what you're gonna get. You're not getting a luxury writing experience, but you are getting a large handmade ebonite pen for $100, or let's call it under $200 with a titanium nib. And there's just not a lot out there in the market to compete. I think it's a class in a class of its own, and I think it makes a really strong value proposition and just a cool pen to add to your collection. I'm not a Ranga collector. This is the only Ranga that I own, and I think it's the only Ranga that I will own. I don't feel the need to buy a bunch of these like I have done with other brands, but to have one in the collection, I think it's a solid value proposition. I think it's just a cool pen to have and a fun one to use. So anyway, I hope that was useful. I hope you enjoyed a look at a pen that is not too common. As I've seen with other videos on my channel, the less common pens don't get a lot of views, so I guess not a lot of people will watch this, but I hope people do. I hope people get to see and experience something different and something pretty cool. So thank you for watching, and have a great weekend.